When we speak of the empath's return, we must first discard the childish fantasy of triumph that the modern mind so eagerly clings to. What is beginning now is not visible because it does not announce itself in the language of victory. It does not arrive with applause, nor with the outward signs of power that the collective worships. It begins, as all profound psychological transformations do, in silence, in obscurity, and most disturbingly, in apparent weakness. The psyche does not reveal its greatest movements to the crowd. It reveals them to the one who has been forced inward, often against their will. You, who feel this stirring, may not yet trust it. You may even mistake it for exhaustion, withdrawal, or resignation. That would be understandable. For many years, perhaps for most of your life, you have lived with an open psychic boundary. You felt others before you felt yourself. You absorbed moods, needs, and unspoken demands as if they were your own. The world taught you to call this virtue. It rewarded you just enough to keep you compliant, but never enough to make you sovereign. And so you learn to survive by attunement rather than by authority. But the psyche keeps its own accounts. What is repressed does not disappear, it descends. What is sacrificed without consciousness does not become holy, it becomes poisonous. And so, beneath your generosity, beneath your endurance, beneath your patience, something accumulated, not rage in the crude sense, but a dense, unspoken knowledge, the knowledge of having lived too long without a center. This is where the comeback truly begins, not in strength, but in disillusionment. The empath reaches a moment when their suffering no longer feels meaningful. This is crucial. As long as pain can be mythologized as purpose, transformation is postponed. Only when the soul says, quietly and without drama, this can no longer be justified, does the unconscious begin to reorganize itself. In my clinical work, I observed this moment often, though patients rarely recognized it as significant. They would report a strange dullness where once there was intensity, a reluctance to explain themselves, an aversion to emotional negotiations that previously felt compulsory. They feared this change. They worried they were becoming cold, selfish, or unloving. In truth, they were becoming bounded. The collective has no language for this. It praises empathy only when empathy remains exploitable. The moment it develops gravity, the moment it refuses to circulate freely, it is labeled withdrawal, arrogance, or betrayal. But psychologically, what is happening is far more ancient. The archetype of the wounded healer is withdrawing from the village to tend to the wound that was never allowed to close. You see, the empath's tragedy is not that they feel too much. It is that they were never taught to discriminate between what belongs to them and what does not. In early life, this confusion is often adaptive. In families where emotional survival depends on vigilance, where moods shift unpredictably, where love is conditional, where harmony must be maintained at all costs, the child learns to read the room before they read themselves. Sensitivity becomes a strategy, not a gift, and strategies, when mistaken for identity, hollow the soul. The unconscious does not forget this. It waits. It waits through relationships that repeat the original wound, through workplaces that reward self-erasure, through spiritual frameworks that glorify sacrifice while quietly despising power. And then, often in midlife, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, it begins to speak in a different tone, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Dreams change first. The empath may begin to dream of locked rooms, of forgotten houses, of animals that watch from a distance rather than approach. They may dream of saying no without consequence, or of leaving without explanation. These are not random images. They are symbolic rehearsals. The psyche practices autonomy before it allows it to manifest in waking life. At the same time, the outer world begins to react, though no one names it. Others feel a subtle resistance where once there was compliance. They sense a withdrawal of emotional supply, even if no boundary has been spoken aloud. This is why nobody sees the comeback yet. From the outside, it looks like less engagement, less availability, less emotional labor. But psychologically, less is the necessary precondition for more. The empath has lived too long as an open system, and open systems, while generous, cannot accumulate energy. Power requires containment. Meaning requires form. The psyche knows this instinctively. That is why the return of the empath is not flamboyant. It is structural. There is often a period uncomfortable, ambiguous, and deeply misunderstood where the empath appears to lose their defining qualities. They feel flatter, they are less reactive, they stop rescuing, they stop interpreting silence as a call to action. To the untrained eye, this looks like decline. To the unconscious, it is consolidation. This is the moment when the shadow begins to integrate not as aggression, but as refusal. The shadow of the empath is not cruelty. It is the capacity to withhold, to disappoint, to remain unmoved by emotional pressure. These capacities were always present, but banished in childhood because they threatened attachment. Now, they return as guardians of the self. You must understand this. The empath's comeback is not about becoming dominant over others. It is about becoming opaque to manipulation. That is why it frightens those who benefited from your transparency. They will sense something has changed long before they can articulate it. They may accuse you of being different, distant, or difficult. These accusations are projections. What they truly mean is you no longer function as expected. From a Jungian perspective, this is individuation in its most dangerous phase. Dangerous not because it is violent, but because it destabilizes established psychic contracts. When one person withdraws unconscious participation, the entire relational field must reorganize. Most systems resist this. They prefer a wounded empath to a whole one. Internally, you may feel guilt. This is inevitable. Guilt is the psyche's residue of outdated loyalties. It does not indicate wrongdoing, it indicates transition. The task is not to eliminate guilt, but to outgrow its authority. The mature psyche does not ask, "Am I good?" It asks, "Am I whole?" The comeback, then, is not visible because it is not performative. It is not announced. It does not seek validation. It occurs in the slow recalibration of value, what you respond to, what you tolerate, what you explain, and, crucially, what you no longer attempt to fix. There is an ancient image that captures this moment perfectly: the hermit withdrawing from the marketplace, not in bitterness, but in necessity. He does not hate the world. He simply recognizes that his light has been leaking, and so he turns inward, not to disappear, but to condense. This condensation is power, not the power to control others, but the power to remain intact in their presence. When the empath achieves this, something remarkable happens. Influence returns, but this time it is gravitational rather than reactive. People feel it without being able to name it. They sense a center where once there was diffusion. This is why nobody sees it yet. The world is trained to notice noise, not depth. It sees expansion, not integration. But the psyche knows better. It knows that all true comebacks begin underground. And if you are attentive, truly attentive, you will notice that your life is already rearranging itself around this new axis. Situations that once drained you now repel you. Conversations that demanded explanation now fall silent. You are no longer compelled to make yourself understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. This is not apathy, it is discernment, awakening after a long exile. The empath's greatest comeback is not about reclaiming the past. It is about refusing to repeat it, and that refusal, quiet and uncelebrated, is the most radical act the psyche can perform. What comes next will not be comfortable. Individuation never is, but it will be real, and for the first time, your sensitivity will no longer be a wound waiting to be reopened, but an instrument you choose when and only when it serves the truth of your becoming. The psyche does not permit this transformation without resistance. Once the empath begins to withdraw their unconscious participation, forces long dormant rise to the surface, both within and without. Internally, the shadow does not arrive as a sudden burst of rage, as popular psychology would have you believe. It arrives as a question that has never before been allowed to form: why must I be the one who understands? This question is subversive. It dismantles an entire identity structure built around moral superiority disguised as virtue. For years, perhaps decades, you survived by being the one who could see from every angle. You learned to anticipate disappointment, to soften truth before it could wound, to absorb emotional overflow that others could not metabolize themselves. This capacity became so integrated into your sense of self that you mistook it for character rather than adaptation. But adaptation, when prolonged beyond necessity, becomes pathology wearing a halo. The unconscious knows this, and so, as the comeback begins, it engineers situations that feel strangely repetitive, yet subtly altered. You may notice familiar relational patterns returning, but with one crucial difference: you are no longer willing to pay the same price for harmony. This refusal unsettles the old order. People who relied on your emotional elasticity begin to experience anxiety, irritation, even hostility. They cannot articulate what is wrong, only that something essential is missing. From their perspective, it feels like abandonment. From a psychological perspective, it is differentiation. Differentiation is not separation. It is the capacity to remain oneself in the presence of another without collapse or fusion. The empath was never allowed this capacity early in life. Emotional safety depended on merging, on being indispensable, on becoming the stabilizing force in unstable systems. To differentiate now feels dangerous, even immoral, yet without it, there can be no individuation. At this stage, dreams often become darker, more confrontational. The psyche no longer soothes, it instructs. You may dream of confronting figures of authority, of refusing entry, of watching buildings burn without intervening. These images disturb the conscious mind because they violate the empath's long-standing pact with goodness. But they are not instructions to destroy. They are symbolic declarations of psychic sovereignty. The shadow of the empath contains everything that was forbidden in order to maintain attachment: selfishness, anger, indifference, and above all, power. Not power as domination, but power as self-possession. Until these elements are integrated, empathy remains naive, and naivety is always exploitable. The danger at this phase is regression masquerading as compassion. The psyche, frightened by its own emergence, may attempt to retreat into old roles, to rescue once more, to explain, to soften, to endure. This is often accompanied by a peculiar nostalgia, a longing for the clarity of suffering. Pain, after all, provided structure. It told you who you were needed by. Healing, by contrast, introduces ambiguity. It removes the script. Here, the archetype of the orphan becomes active. The empath must confront the fact that much of their giving was motivated by an unconscious hope that if they were essential enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, they would finally be chosen, protected, or seen. This hope is ancient. It belongs to the child who learned that love required vigilance. Letting it die feels like betrayal of that child. But psychologically, it is not betrayal, it is belated protection. The comeback demands a mourning process that few speak of. You are not only grieving lost relationships, you are grieving the identity that survived by overextending itself. You are grieving the fantasy that your suffering had guaranteed meaning. This grief is quiet and often invisible, which is why the world does not recognize it. But it is decisive. Without it, the empath remains bound to repetition. As this mourning deepens, a curious thing happens. You begin to tolerate misunderstanding. Where once you rushed to clarify, to repair perception, to manage others' feelings about you, you now allow misinterpretation to exist. This is not cruelty. It is a refusal to manage realities that are not yours. The psyche is learning that clarity does not require consensus. This shift alone alters every relational dynamic. Those accustomed to your emotional availability may escalate, becoming louder, more dramatic, more wounded. This escalation is not evidence of your failure. It is evidence of withdrawal symptoms in the relational field. You were, without realizing it, regulating more than your share of collective emotion. When you stop, imbalance surfaces. Internally, this can trigger doubt. You may wonder if you are becoming callous, disconnected, or spiritually regressive. But the unconscious is precise. It does not dismantle capacities without purpose. What is being removed is not empathy, but compulsion. Empathy that survives compulsion becomes discernment. Discernment is the empath's true authority. It allows you to feel without surrendering, to perceive without absorbing, to respond without self-erasure. This capacity feels unfamiliar because it was never modeled. You are building it from the inside, guided not by social approval, but by somatic truth. Your body often knows before your mind does. Fatigue, tension, and aversion become signals rather than obstacles. You stop overriding them in the name of being good. At this point, the persona, the social mask, begins to crack. The empath's persona was often constructed around being safe, kind, and reliable. These qualities are not false, but they were over-identified. Individuation requires loosening this identification. You begin to sense that being liked is no longer sufficient compensation for being divided within yourself. This is where the comeback gains momentum. Though still unseen, you speak less, but with more weight. You listen differently, not scanning for what is needed, but observing what is revealed. Silence becomes an instrument rather than a void to be filled. Others may find this unsettling. They were accustomed to your cues, your reassurance, your interpretive labor. Now they must encounter themselves. Symbolically, this is the moment when the empath steps out of the role of emotional mirror and becomes a reflective surface only when consciously chosen. Mirrors exhaust themselves by constant use. A polished stone, by contrast, reflects only when light strikes it at the right angle. The unconscious rewards this shift with a subtle but profound change in energy. You may feel less driven, yet more grounded, less urgent, yet more present. The frenetic need to be useful gives way to a quieter sense of relevance. This relevance does not depend on demand. It emerges from alignment. Here, many empaths experience a temporary isolation, not because they have rejected the world, but because the world has not yet learned how to meet them. Old relationships fall away or transform. New ones have not yet formed. This liminal space is uncomfortable, but essential. It is the psyche's antechamber, where old contracts dissolve before new ones can be written. If you rush to fill this space, you sabotage the process. Loneliness here is not a symptom, it is a condition. It allows the psyche to recalibrate its orientation toward others. For the first time, connection is not pursued as survival, but as choice. This choice frightens the old complexes. They will attempt to reassert themselves through guilt, fear, or grand narratives of obligation. But notice this, their arguments feel thin now. They no longer command unquestioned obedience. You can hear them without being governed by them. This is the sound of authority shifting inward. The empath's comeback is therefore not a return to visibility, but a return to authorship. You are no longer living as a footnote in other people's stories. You are writing from a center that was long deferred. The world may not applaud this, it may not even notice, but the psyche does not require witnesses. It requires coherence, and coherence, once established, alters everything that comes near it. What follows this phase is not confrontation, but consequence. As you stabilize, the external world begins to reorganize around your new boundaries. Opportunities that require self-betrayal lose their appeal. Roles that demand emotional overextension feel uninhabitable. This is not loss, it is selection becoming conscious. You are no longer fighting for space, you are occupying it. The comeback continues, quietly, relentlessly, beneath the threshold of spectacle. It is not designed to impress, it is designed to endure. And in this endurance, a new archetype begins to emerge. Not the wounded healer, not the self-sacrificing empath, but the integrated individual who can enter the world without dissolving into it. This archetype is rare because it cannot be taught. It must be earned through disillusionment, mourning, and restraint. Few will recognize it while it is forming. Fewer still will understand it when it stands before them. But the psyche does not ask to be understood. It asks to be realized. And that realization is already underway. As this realization stabilizes, the psyche enters a more perilous terrain, one that few empaths anticipate because it does not resemble healing as they were taught to imagine it. There is no catharsis here, no dramatic release, no moment of triumphant clarity. Instead, there is a deepening sobriety. The empath begins to perceive the full cost of their former way of being, not only what others took, but what they themselves unconsciously offered in exchange for belonging. This recognition is unsettling because it dismantles the last refuge of moral innocence. You begin to see that overgiving was not only something done to you, it was something you participated in, not out of malice or manipulation, but out of fear, fear of abandonment, fear of invisibility, fear of becoming irrelevant. This is a difficult truth to face because it strips suffering of its purity. Yet it is precisely here that power returns. Responsibility, when assumed without self-condemnation, becomes agency. The psyche does not punish you for this insight. It liberates you through it. At this stage, the unconscious often withdraws emotional intensity. Many empaths report feeling strangely neutral, even indifferent, towards situations that once consumed them. This neutrality can be misinterpreted as numbness. It is not, it is detachment without dissociation. The nervous system, having lived too long in hyper-attunement, is learning to rest in itself. This rest is deceptive. From the outside, it appears as passivity. Internally, it is consolidation. Energy that was once spent tracking, anticipating, and repairing others is now being reclaimed. And reclaimed energy does not rush. It settles, it thickens, it becomes available for direction rather than reaction. Here, a subtle arrogance may surface, not the loud arrogance of superiority, but the quiet arrogance of self-trust. You begin to believe your own perceptions without immediately checking them against external approval. This is dangerous territory for the old complexes. They will accuse you of becoming rigid, judgmental, or closed-hearted. But notice this: your heart is not closed. It is no longer indiscriminately open. The difference is profound. The empath's sensitivity was once porous. Now it becomes selective. This selectivity is not learned through rules, but through fatigue. You have simply exhausted the impulse to explain yourself into coherence. You discover that truth does not need persuasion when it is embodied. This embodiment changes your presence. Others may find it harder to draw you into emotional spirals. You do not resist them, you simply do not follow. There is a pause now where there once was immediacy. In that pause, something decisive occurs. You are no longer living inside other people's urgency. Symbolically, this is the moment when the empath steps out of the flood and onto the riverbank. You can still see the current, you can still feel its pull, but you are no longer carried by it. And from the riverbank, perception changes, patterns become visible that were impossible to see while submerged. You begin to recognize how often connection was confused with intensity, how drama masqueraded as depth, how need was mistaken for intimacy. These realizations do not make you bitter, they make you precise. Precision is the enemy of illusion. At this point, the psyche often introduces images of authority into dreams, not tyrants, but judges, elders, or silent observers. These figures do not instruct, they witness. Their presence signals the emergence of an inner tribunal that is no longer outsourced to the world. You begin to evaluate situations based on internal coherence rather than external expectation. This inner authority is fragile at first. It must be protected from premature exposure. If you attempt to justify it, to explain it, to defend it before it has fully formed, it will collapse back into accommodation. That is why the psyche encourages restraint. You speak less not because you have nothing to say, but because you are learning the weight of words. In relationships, this phase is often marked by a quiet sorting. Some people drift away without conflict. Others test boundaries with increasing desperation. They may escalate emotional appeals, resurrect old grievances, or accuse you of changing. They are not wrong. You have changed, but what they sense is not loss of care, it is loss of access. Access is the currency that was once freely given. Now it is earned through reciprocity, respect, and presence. This revaluation feels radical because it reverses the empath's long-standing economy of love. You no longer give in order to be included. You include those who meet you. This inversion can feel lonely, yet it carries a strange dignity. You are no longer auditioning for belonging. You are inhabiting it internally. The psyche, satisfied with this internal shift, begins to test it externally. Situations arise that would have once triggered immediate intervention conflict, misunderstanding, emotional distress in others. This time, you do not move automatically, you wait, you observe, and often something remarkable happens. The situation resolves itself, or reveals that your intervention was never truly required. This realization is both relieving and painful. Relieving because it frees you from an impossible burden, painful because it exposes how much of your life was spent compensating for dynamics that were not yours to manage. Grief returns here, but it is cleaner, less dramatic, more final. You are no longer asking, "Why did this happen to me?" You are asking, "Why did I stay?" This question does not seek blame, it seeks clarity, and clarity is the precondition for choice. As choice emerges, so does direction. For the first time, you may feel drawn toward pursuits that are not immediately useful to others. Creativity, study, solitude, or quiet mastery may call to you. These impulses were once suppressed because they did not serve immediate relational needs. Now, they feel essential, not as self-expression, but as self-construction. This is the stage where the empath begins to build a life rather than merely respond to one. The world may still not see it. There is no spectacle here, no announcement, no declaration of independence. There is simply a gradual reorientation of energy toward what deepens rather than depletes. Those who are attuned will feel it. Those who relied on your depletion will resent it. Both reactions are confirmations. The psyche is patient. It has waited long enough. It is not interested in haste. It is interested in alignment. And alignment, once established, has consequences that extend far beyond intention. You are no longer preparing for the comeback. You are living inside it. What remains is not the question of whether you will return to the world differently, but how the world will respond when it realizes that what it once took for granted is no longer available on demand. That reckoning approaches quietly, and it will not require your participation to unfold. When that reckoning arrives, it does not announce itself with conflict. It arrives as an absence, the absence of your reflexive availability, the absence of your emotional translation, the absence of your willingness to absorb what others refuse to face in themselves. And absence, as you are now discovering, is far more instructive than confrontation ever was. Those who once oriented themselves around your responsiveness begin to experience disorientation. They may search for the old cues, the familiar openings, the subtle signals that once told them they were safe to continue as they were, but the cues do not appear, not because you are withholding in punishment, but because the psyche no longer produces them. What was once automatic has become impossible. This is an important distinction. You are not choosing restraint as a strategy. You are inhabiting a structure in which overextension no longer fits. The nervous system will not comply. The body will not mobilize. The soul will not translate what is not its language. This is not resistance. It is reorganization. At this stage, something that once seemed unthinkable becomes natural. You allow others to experience the consequences of their own psychic patterns. This was previously intolerable to you. You believed that if you did not intervene, something would collapse: relationships, stability, even love itself. Now you witness collapse without panic. You see that not all disintegration is destructive. Some structures must fail in order for truth to emerge. Here, the archetype shifts again. The empath is no longer the wounded healer nor the solitary hermit. A new figure takes shape, quieter and more unsettling, the one who does not interfere with fate. This figure appears in myths as the silent witness, the watcher at the threshold, the presence that neither saves nor condemns. It is a mature archetype, and it requires restraint that few can tolerate. Restraint has been misunderstood in your life. It was once associated with suppression, with swallowing truth, with enduring what should not have been endured. Now restraint has a different quality. It is the capacity to act only when action is aligned, and to remain still when stillness is truthful. This is not passivity. It is precision. With precision comes a new relationship to power. You no longer fear it, nor do you romanticize it. power is no longer imagined as force or dominance. It is recognized as coherence over time, the ability to remain consistent with oneself in changing circumstances, the ability to let reactions pass without being conscripted by them, the ability to say nothing and mean it. This terrifies immature systems. They depended on your immediacy, your responsiveness, your emotional labor. Without it, they must confront their own instability. Some will attempt to provoke you back into motion. They may test boundaries indirectly, manufacture crises, or reinterpret your silence as hostility. But notice how little this moves you now. You see the pattern without entering it. This is the moment when the empath becomes dangerous, not because they intend harm, but because they are no longer governable by guilt. Guilt was the primary lever used to access you. It framed your exhaustion as virtue and your availability as obligation. Now guilt still appears, but it no longer commands action. It has become information rather than instruction. Psychologically, this is a decisive threshold. When guilt loses authority, the psyche is free to reorganize its values. You no longer ask what is expected, you ask what is sustainable. You no longer measure goodness by sacrifice, you measure it by integrity. Integrity is not purity, it is alignment between inner truth and outer action. This alignment requires that some relationships change or end, not through rejection, but through incompatibility. You are no longer shaped to fit certain dynamics, and the psyche will not contort itself again to preserve them. As this becomes clear, a subtle confidence emerges, not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of orientation. You know where you stand, even when you do not know what will happen. This is a form of trust deeper than optimism. It is trust in the psyche's capacity to self-regulate. From this place, empathy returns but transformed. It is no longer compulsive. It does not rush ahead of discernment. It does not attempt to heal what has not asked to be healed. It listens without merging. It feels without absorbing. It responds without disappearing. This empathy is not exhausting. It is clean. Clean empathy has a surprising effect. People who are capable of meeting you often feel deeply seen by it. People who relied on your self-erasure feel exposed by it. They may accuse you of being distant, intimidating, or changed. All of these are defenses against a presence that can no longer be controlled. You are no longer negotiating your reality, you are inhabiting it. This is where the comeback becomes irreversible, not because of anything you do, but because of what you no longer can do. You cannot pretend not to know what you know. You cannot unknow the cost of certain patterns. You cannot return to the illusion that understanding others requires abandoning yourself. The psyche has crossed a point of no return. From here, life simplifies, not because it becomes easy, but because it becomes coherent. You make fewer promises. You tolerate less ambiguity. You invest your energy where it circulates rather than leaks. This may look smaller from the outside, fewer connections, less drama, less noise, but internally it feels expansive. There is room now, room to think, room to feel, room to choose. Choice is the final gift of this transformation. Not choice as preference, but choice as authorship. You are no longer reacting to inherited scripts. You are writing from experience rather than defense. This authorship does not require recognition. It requires fidelity. The world may eventually notice. It may sense that something it once relied on is no longer available in the same way. Some will adapt, some will resent, some will disappear. None of this is your task to manage. You have already done enough managing for a lifetime. What matters is this: the empath's greatest comeback was never meant to be seen at first. If it were, it would be contaminated by performance. It had to occur in obscurity, in silence, in the slow reconstitution of inner authority. Now, when you enter a room, you do not scan it for permission. When you speak, you do not brace for misunderstanding. When you withdraw, you do not apologize. These are not techniques, they are consequences. The psyche has reclaimed its center. And from this center, you will engage the world differently, not as a resource to be consumed by others, not as a mirror for their unexamined selves, but as an individual who can participate without vanishing. This is not the end of the journey, it is the end of exile. What comes next will unfold according to its own rhythm. It does not require urgency. It does not require explanation. It requires presence. And presence, once restored, changes everything it touches quietly, irrevocably, and without asking to be seen